Julian walked through the hall full of lights and elegant people, feeling a little out of place. The atmosphere was luxurious with expensive perfumes and hushed conversations, and he, wearing a simple suit, noticed how everything around him seemed too sophisticated. Even so, he knew he was there for a noble reason, to support an important cause and perhaps make some connections for his work. Although the luxury made him uncomfortable, Julian stood firm, remembering all the difficulties he had overcome to get there. He decided that even if he didn't belong in that world, he could make a difference. After all, sometimes we need to face these challenges in order to move forward and help others. As Julian walked through the hall, his eyes were drawn to a woman who seemed to stand out from the crowd. She had a radiant beauty, and her presence seemed to illuminate her surroundings. Although she was surrounded by other people, she seemed oblivious to the superficial conversation, which made Julian even more interested. Feeling curious and attracted, Julian decided to get closer. There was something different about her, something that made him believe she was worth getting to know better. Even in a place full of luxury and formality, this woman seemed to be someone authentic, which motivated him to take the first step towards her with courage. Julian approached the woman near the drinks table, trying to look relaxed. He poured himself some wine and with a smile wished her a good evening. The woman, whose name was Vivian, responded with a gentle smile and curiosity in her eyes, making Julian feel a little more at ease. They began to chat lightly, exchanging a few thoughts about the event. Julian noticed that although the atmosphere was sophisticated, Vivian was friendly and approachable. This made him even more interested, and he continued the conversation, sensing that there was something special in that casual exchange of words. As they chatted, Vivian began to talk more enthusiastically and revealed the real reason she was at the event. She told Julian that her great passion was education, and that she believed that everyone, regardless of where they came from, deserved a fair chance in life. The charity event, she explained, was aimed at raising funds for schools in underprivileged areas, something that touched her heart deeply. Julian was impressed by Vivian's passion. It wasn't just her beauty that charmed him, but her determination to help others and make a difference. He realized that he was facing someone very special, not just because of her presence, but because of her genuine desire to change the world through education. This made Julian connect with her even more. In the middle of the engaging conversation, Julian noticed an older man approaching, who soon revealed himself to be Vivian's father. With a firm and authoritative posture, he addressed her, saying that they needed to go on to the next part of the event. The way he spoke made it clear that he was in control of the situation, and there was no room for Vivian to refuse. Vivian smiled at Julian with an apologetic look on her face, letting him know that she also regretted the abrupt end to the conversation. She said goodbye politely, and Julian stood there watching as she walked away with her father. Despite the brief interruption, he felt that something important had happened during that meeting, and that he wanted to get to know her better. After Vivian left with her father, Julian stood still for a few moments, reflecting on what had just happened. He had never felt so connected to someone in such a short space of time. It wasn't just because of her beauty, but because of the way she spoke passionately about education, something that also touched Julian in a profound way. He knew he had to get to know her better, even if the way to do so was complicated. As he watched the rest of the event, Julian sensed that Vivian was different from the other people there. She didn't seem attached to luxury or appearances. There was something genuine and special about her, something he didn't see in anyone else. In that environment full of superficialities, he also remembered his own story of overcoming, coming from humble beginnings, and felt that Vivian could somehow understand that part of him. This only increased his desire to meet her again. Julian, however, knew it wouldn't be easy. Her father seemed to be a powerful figure, and the fact that Vivian was always surrounded surrounded by important people indicated that she lived in a world very different from his own, but instead of feeling discouraged, this motivated him even more. Julian had overcome challenges before, and now he was determined to face this new obstacle. He didn't know how, but he was sure that he would do everything to get close to Vivian again. For the rest of the night, Julian could hardly get Vivian out of his mind. He began to think of different ways to see her again. He knew that the event had created an opportunity, but he had to act quickly so as not to lose contact. For him, that meeting hadn't been by chance, and something inside him said that getting to know Vivian better could change his life in unexpected ways. In the days following the event, Julian couldn't stop thinking about Vivian. He knew she was someone special, but he also knew that the difference between the worlds in which they lived could be a major obstacle. Vivian came from a powerful and influential family. While he had fought hard to achieve what he had, however, Julian wasn't willing to give up so easily. He needed to find a way to get close to her without being judged for his humble origins. It was then that a daring idea began to form in his mind. What if he disguised himself as a chauffeur to observe Vivian's family up close? That way he could better understand what her parents were really like without them knowing who he really was. Julian wanted to see how they treated simple, ordinary people, like a driver, for example. If they were respectful and considerate of someone who didn't have status, there might be a chance that they would accept him for who he was rather than where he came from. At first the idea seemed absurd, almost like a joke, but the more Julian thought about it, the more it made sense. If he presented himself formally as himself, he feared that he would be rejected immediately, but as a chauffeur he could observe, learn, and perhaps find a way to win her family's trust. Julian knew it was a risky plan, but his desire to be with Vivian and prove himself outweighed any fear he might feel. Determined, Julian began to plan the details. He needed to get ready, hire a luxury car, and get a simple but appropriate uniform to look like a private chauffeur. He knew that this disguise would allow him to see the reality behind appearances, and at the same time put him in a unique position to approach Vivian without being immediately rejected for his social status. The plan was in motion, and Julian was ready to do whatever it took to win Vivian's heart and face any challenge that came his way. After thinking long and hard about the plan, Julian knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed Vivian's help, so he decided to call her and explain what he had in mind. When Vivian answered, her voice sounded like music to Julian's ears. He hesitated for a moment, but then got straight to the point. He wanted to get to know her better, but he also wanted to understand her family without the weight of expectations that her status could create. Then carefully he revealed his daring plan. "I was thinking, what if I disguised myself as a chauffeur at your family's next event," said Julian, almost joking, but knowing that the idea was serious. On the other end of the line, Vivian remained silent for a few seconds, surprised by the unusual proposal. "Do you want to pass yourself off as a chauffeur?" she asked, with a mixture of curiosity and concern in her voice. Julian then explained that this was the only way to observe how her parents treated ordinary people without being influenced by their appearance or position. Vivian, although reluctant, understood Raphael's motivation. He didn't just want to win her over, he wanted to ensure that his family could accept him for who he really was. She pondered for a few more moments, knowing that her father was a difficult man to deal with and that this plan was risky. However, Julian's sincerity and determination touched her deeply. He was willing to do something so daring to prove that he loved her. and wanted to be accepted. "All right, Julian, we'll do it, but please be careful," she replied, her voice now soft and full of confidence. With Vivian's approval, Julian felt a sense of relief mixed with excitement. Now the plan was in motion, and he knew that with Vivian by his side he was ready to face whatever came his way. The next family event would be the perfect setting to test Raphael's patience and courage. He didn't know what to expect, but he was sure it would be worth it, because in the end the goal was much bigger: to win Vivian's love and at the same time prove that he was worthy of being by her side regardless of where he came from. With the plan in place, Julian knew he had little time to prepare. He needed everything to be perfect. The next day he started organizing the details, renting a luxury car and finding a simple uniform, but one that would make him look like a real chauffeur. He practiced keeping a low profile, the kind of behavior that no one would notice in a chauffeur. He knew that in this role he had to be almost invisible, but at the same time attentive to all the details around him. The night before the big event, Julian could barely sleep. His head was full of thoughts about what could go wrong. He knew it would be a decisive night. If it was discovered, everything could fall apart, not just the plan but the chance to get closer to Vivian and her family. Even so, he believed that this was the only way to prove his worth. As dawn approached, anxiety overwhelmed him, but he remained calm and decided that he was prepared for anything. Finally, the big day arrived. Julian carefully put on his uniform and adjusted the cap on his head. When he looked in the mirror, he almost didn't recognize himself. He looked simple, discreet, almost unrecognizable, exactly as he had planned. He picked up his car keys and took a deep breath, knowing that he was about to embark on one of the most challenging missions of his life. Every detail had to be perfect, and Julian knew that any mistake could ruin his chances. When he arrived at Vivian's house, his heart pounded as the doorbell rang. A maid answered without even looking at him, just telling him to wait in the car. Julian obeyed, settling into the driver's seat and adjusting the rear-view mirror. He gazed intently at the imposing entrance to the mansion, aware that from that moment on he was immersed in his disguise. The plan was underway, and there was no turning back. As soon as Vivian's family got into the car, Julian quickly noticed the formal and distant atmosphere that dominated the room. Vivian's father, with an authoritarian tone, ordered him to take them to the restaurant without even looking in his direction. It was as if Julian was just an extension of the car, something that didn't deserve to be noticed. He stood his ground, following the instructions and focusing on the driving, but he could already sense that the evening would reveal more than he had expected. As he drove through the illuminated streets, Julian heard snippets of conversation between Vivian's parents. They talked about business and social events, but what really bothered him was the way they referred to people from lower social classes. "These events are necessary, but I hate having to deal with people from such low levels," Vivian's mother said with a bore sigh. Her father agreed, saying that it's the price you pay for keeping up appearances. Each word felt like a small stab in the heart for Julian, who knew well the value of the people they despised. Even without saying anything, Julian felt the weight of Vivian's parents' words. He knew he was hearing their true opinion, something they would never say in public or in front of someone important. This contempt for humble people made him question whether he could really be accepted by that family, but at the same time it reinforced his determination to prove that he was much more than his origins. He kept his eyes on the road, trying not to show how uncomfortable he was. The journey continued, and Julian heard more dismissive comments. The discomfort inside the car was palpable, but he knew that in order to continue with the plan he would have to put up with these attitudes. What worried him most was Vivian, who, sitting in the back seat, seemed oblivious to her parents' conversation. He wondered how she was coping, and if somehow she also felt out of place in that environment. Every word her parents said only increased her desire to fight for that love, and at the same time to prove that her worth went far beyond appearances. As Julian continued to drive, the weather began to change dramatically. Dark clouds covered the sky and soon a heavy rain began to fall. The sound of the drops hitting the glass and the wet asphalt made every moment more tense. The streets, once clear and quiet, were now slippery and treacherous, making Julian have to redouble his attention to keep control of the car. The silence inside the vehicle was broken only by the slight sound of the passengers' breathing, all of them apparently tense as they drove on. The storm grew stronger, and on a sharp bend the car began to slide slightly. Julian, with all the calm he could muster, stepped on the brake in a controlled manner, avoiding an accident. The movement, however, caused the passengers to hold on to their seats. Clearly frightened, Vivian's father, irritated, shouted, "What's this? Can't you drive?" Julian, standing his ground around, apologized and explained that the roads were very slippery because of the rain. He tried to suggest a short break, but Vivian's father was adamant. "Keep going, we can't just stand here in the middle of nowhere." Vivian, sitting in the back seat, looked out of the window, apparently oblivious to the tension in the air. Julian noticed that she avoided facing her parents and at times even looked a little sad. However, he could do no more than drive, struggling to keep calm as the storm worsened. Even under pressure, Julian felt the responsibility of protecting the passengers and at the same time dealing with the demands and criticisms of Vivian's father. With the rain making it increasingly difficult to see the road, Julian slowed down and kept his full focus on driving. He knew he was facing a critical situation. Every bend posed a risk, and the harsh weather added to the tension inside the car. Julian's heart was beating fast, but he refused to give up. He was determined to get them to their destination safely, even if the journey was longer and more challenging than expected. After a tense and challenging journey, Julian knew he couldn't continue with the disguise for much longer. When they arrived at the restaurant and got out of the car, he felt that the moment of truth was approaching. The weight of what he had heard from Vivian's parents during the journey made him realize that it was time to reveal who he really was. The night was full of emotions, and Julian knew he had to be honest, even if it brought unpredictable consequences. When Vivian's family finished dinner and returned to the car, Julian mentally prepared himself as he drove back to the mansion. He felt his heart racing when they arrived at the house. After a night full of tension, Julian took courage and, before saying goodbye, decided to reveal his true identity. "I'm not just the chauffeur," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion. "My name is Julian and I'm your daughter's fiancé." The silence inside the car was immediate and almost suffocating. Vivian's father, clearly shocked, remained silent for a few seconds, unable to believe what he had just heard. When he finally reacted, his anger was palpable. "You dare deceive us like that?" he shouted, his face red with indignation. Vivian's mother was also visibly surprised and confused, while Vivian looked at Julian with watery eyes, realizing how serious he was. Julian knew that this was a risk he would have to face, but he believed it was the only way to be completely honest. Despite the tension in the air, Julian remained calm. He explained that the disguise was his way of seeing what Vivian's family was really like without the interference of prejudice. He wanted to know if they would accept him for who he really was and not for his appearance or position. Vivian, feeling the weight of the revelation, stepped forward and bravely defended Julian. "I love him," she said, looking at her parents, "and he did it because he wanted to protect us and ensure that our love could overcome any barrier." As soon as Julian revealed his true identity, Vivian's father exploded with rage. He couldn't accept that someone from a humble background like Julian had infiltrated his family pretending to be a chauffeur. Do you think you can deceive us and still expect us to accept this? He shouted, his face red with indignation. For him this was an unforgivable betrayal. He felt disrespected and cheated, and the idea of Julian becoming part of his family seemed unbearable. Vivian's mother, although more restrained, didn't hide her displeasure either. She looked at Julian with a mixture of sadness and disappointment, clearly annoyed by the situation. "You lie to us," she said, her voice softer but full of reproach. For Vivian's parents' social status had always been a priority, and they simply couldn't understand how someone like Julian with so little to offer in terms of wealth and power could be good enough for their daughter. Vivian, however, did not remain silent. She looked at her parents, her voice firm and resolute. "You're wrong," she said. "Julian did this because he wanted to make sure that you would see who he really is without the usual prejudices." She knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but she couldn't let her parents belittle the man she loved. "He's not here for money or status, and that's what makes him different from anyone else. You know I love him and I won't give him up." Vivian's father, still furious, looked from one to the other, trying to find a way to undo all this. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, unable to accept the situation. But seeing the determination in his daughter's eyes, he began to realize that he wouldn't be able to change what had already been done. Even if he didn't agree with the relationship, he couldn't ignore how much Vivian was willing to fight for Julian. At that point, her parents' resistance began to weaken, but the battle was not yet completely won. When Vivian's father finally managed to calm down a little, something unexpected happened. He took a deep breath, looked directly at Julian, and made a surprising revelation. "I knew who you were from the beginning," he said in a calm voice, but still full of frustration. Everyone fell silent, especially Julian, who was taken aback. "From the moment you walked through the door as a chauffeur, I knew you weren't what you seemed." Julian was confused. "If you knew, why didn't you say anything?" he asked, trying to understand what was going on. Vivian's father gave a small cold smile before answering. "I wanted to test you," he explained. "I wanted to see how far you would go with this farce, to see if you were really worthy of my daughter. I wanted to see if you had the character and patience to deal with the pressure and expectations of our family." For him, all this had been a kind of test, a test not only for Julian but also for the love he had for Vivian. Vivian looked at her father in disbelief. "You knew all this and you let us go through this?" she asked, the pain and anger clear in her voice. Her father nodded slowly, but this time his tone was one of regret. "I thought I was doing what was best, that I was protecting you, but now I see that I made a mistake." He admitted that he had underestimated the relationship between Julian and Vivian, and more importantly, Raphael's character. "You've proved to me that you're willing to fight for my daughter's love, and that's something I didn't expect." Julian, still processing everything that had happened, felt a mixture of relief and surprise. The test he thought he had created for Vivian's family had actually turned against him, but somehow it brought a new perspective. Vivian's father wasn't just angry, he was also impressed by Julian's determination and honesty. Even with the disguise, it was a subtle but important acknowledgement that Julian was more than his humble origins, and that his love for Vivian had been tested far more than he had imagined. After all the tension and re-rations of the night, Julian and Vivian were ready to move on. With the reluctant approval of Vivian's father and the gradual acceptance of her mother, the couple knew the road would still be difficult, but they were closer than ever. As they left the mansion, the fine rain fell softly, as if it were wiping away the weight of the night. and preparing them for a new beginning. Julian opened the car door for Vivian as he had done earlier in the evening, but this time there was a much stronger connection between them. On the way back, the silence in the car was comfortable. They exchanged glances and soft smiles, both aware that they had overcome a major obstacle together. Although Vivian's parents still had their reservations, the most important thing was that they had taken the first step towards accepting Julian for who he was. More than that, Julian had proved to himself that their love was strong enough to withstand any challenge, and Vivian next to him knew she was next to someone who would face any difficulty for her. Julian looked at Vivian and with a smile said, "We made it." She held his hand and replied, "Yes, we did it, and we're going to keep doing it together." Although they knew their journey had only just begun, that moment represented a victory. They had faced prejudice, expectations, and even a secret test created by Vivian's father, but they had come out stronger on the other side. When they arrived at their destination, Julian and Vivian got out of the car, aware that despite the challenges that still awaited them, they had each other, and with that they felt able to face anything. They were ready for whatever the future held, knowing that their love, now tested and strengthened, was the solid foundation on which they would build their lives together. The road ahead would be long, but they were ready to walk side by side, facing the challenges with courage and determination.